Welcome to On the Record. At midday on Tuesday, the ambulance workers hope that much of Britain will come to a halt for 15 minutes in a demonstration of what they call people power in support of their case against the government. I'll be asking their chief negotiator, Roger Poole, if he really deserves the public support he seems to have. We also have a very special tale of two capital cities. Whose renaissance serves the people best, Paris or London? And has Mrs. Thatcher been woganized? John Cole discerns a new bedside manner, but the victims aren't so sure. We start with the ambulance dispute, which is now 5 months old. There's deadlock and no sign of a breakthrough. Each side accuses the other of obdurance and claims before the High Court of Public Opinion, we're right, they're wrong. Is there any way out of this damaging and disruptive impasse? Roger Poole, so far the public seems to be with you. They seem to think that you have a plausible case. But of course you are principally in business to get the best terms and conditions for your members. That's your job, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But what we also want to have is a very, very good ambulance service. We have one of the finest ambulance services in the world now, but of course it can always be made better. So we'd like to see that as well as an outcome of this dispute.
And of course the public so far may have equated your case with the best route to that ambulance service. It follows from that that were they to think otherwise, that your case was not the best route to that service, your cause would suffer accordingly. It's almost self-evident.
Well, of course.
Now, if they began to think, therefore, that here is just another trade union leader, very presentable, very good on television, very good at the sound bites, but basically fighting the same old trade union corner, defending the trade union turf, they might not be so susceptible to you.
Yes, but of course that isn't the case, is it? I mean, we do have a very good case. Let's just very briefly say what that case is. A qualified ambulance man or woman earns £10,093 a year. That's gross. So when they take their pay home, it can be something less than £170 a week. They get no extra money for working shifts, no extra money for weekends. When they work overtime, it only gets paid at plain time rates. So in pay terms, they're not paid well. But our case isn't just based on that. Our case is also based on us wanting to see a very highly professional, very efficient, very well-trained ambulance service. And I think that's why the public are supporting it.
Right. Now, that is your familiar case, as you've stated it on many occasions now over the last 5 months. You say, as the government says, you want a high-quality service. Let me put to you some of the ways that Kenneth Clarke believes he could deliver a high-quality service, ways which he would like to discuss with you, and see how far you're prepared to go to see his way of seeing. He wants a major restructuring of the service. First of all, making a very clear distinction between those who do emergency and accident work and those who do routine driving, which reflects in terms of use of ambulance something like 1 to 10. 1 accident and emergency, 10 routine. Are you prepared for a very clear distinction between those two with all that might follow from that?
Well, first of all, we ought to get the facts straight. It's not 1 in 10. About 20 to 25% of ambulance journeys are either accident emergencies or very serious cases that need accident and emergency crews. So Mr. Clarke has really got his figures wrong there. But secondly, he has said nothing that isn't happening already. A large number of ambulance services are already tiered in that way. So you have dedicated accident and emergency crews, and you have dedicated outpatient staff. Now, the outpatient staff aren't taxi drivers, as Mr. Clarke has described them. First of all, they're all trained staff, and they are moving those patients that need ambulance transport as opposed to patients that just need a method of transport into a hospital or to a day clinic. So there's nothing new there, and that doesn't really give us a great problem.
Now, if it doesn't give you a great problem, are you prepared to recognize that if the distinction was made absolutely clear as between the two across the whole of Britain, and if there followed from that different skills and different training and pay differentials that reflected that, absolutely and clearly, whether it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 25, you come to some agreement about that, you can accept that principle?
It's already there. There already are pay differentials, and this is one of the problems with the dispute, is that Mr. Clarke has tended to fog some of the issues. You see, there is a difference in the rate of pay already between the qualified ambulance man and woman, that's the accident and emergency people, and the people who run the day side of the service. A very substantial differential between those two. So there's no problem about that either. Now, if the Secretary of State then wants to go a step further, well, we've discussed that with him as well.
Now, let us look at the routine drivers. Another route that appears to be favoured by the government is the prospect of competitive tendering for routine drivers. Do you accept the notion of competitive tendering?
No, of course not, because competitive tendering is about privatisation, and it's about selling the jobs of people to the lowest bidder. And we've seen that amongst the ancillary workers in the National Health Service, haven't we, and all of the problems that that has caused. But you see, every ambulance service already has a taxi service, which is used as a transport service for those people that do not need ambulance transport, but just need a method of conveyance into a hospital. It's known as a hospital car service. It's existed for years. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't believe that people ought to be in ambulances who just need a transport service. We've never argued that. What is needed is an accident emergency tier in order to deal with the accident emergency cases, and you need an outpatient service, the day side of the service, which deals with those people who need ambulance transport but aren't accident and emergency cases.
Well, let's look at the gradation within those who do the routine work. You will know that a great many of those who go by ambulance to hospital one day of the week will very likely go by minibus run by the social services of the local authority on another day of the week.
Well, that's not the case. The people that are
go on.
The people that are in the non-emergency tier are the people who go to hospital by ambulance because a doctor decides that they need an ambulance, and they go into hospital by ambulance. Now, there are some people who just need a transport service into hospital because there's no public transport or something like that. Well, the hospital car service has been there for years. And indeed, it was the trade...
Are you saying that the only people who use ambulances in what we call the routine way are those who could not be taken by any other means but by an ambulance with highly qualified staff? Is that your case, really?
Well, no, because the staff that move those patients aren't as qualified as the accident emergency staff. They have lesser qualifications, but they do have life-saving qualifications. You see, if you're taking a very old person into hospital who's got a serious medical condition, and they have a heart attack on the way into hospital, then they need somebody with resuscitation skills. Now, that is different from, say, a 45-year-old person who's going into hospital for a checkup somewhere, and they purely need some transport into the hospital.
Let's take that elderly person who's going into hospital, not because they're in an emergency, but to have their regular treatment. They're at home, otherwise, or in some kind of care, with someone who is a carer, who doesn't necessarily have any training of a particular kind at all. Now, that same person is not sitting at home all week waiting for that visit to hospital, although you say they need to go in by that ambulance. During the rest of the week, they may go with their family car, being driven to see the grandchildren.
Oh, but that is a matter for a doctor to decide, isn't it? A doctor has to decide whether or not somebody needs ambulance transport. Now, if we're going to have a discussion with the government about the few patients that maybe needed ambulance transport or could go by a taxi, well, let's have that discussion with the government. But for the government to try and pretend that all outpatients can go by taxi is clearly not
right.
Not
now,
true.
we've moved a little way here. We've discovered a little bit of a difference, because you started by saying that all those, apart from those who now use the taxi service or the emergency service, have to go by ambulance. You're saying there is room to discuss there, that there are some maybe of those who use the ambulance service. You will seek to minimize the number, the government will seek to maximize the number who could go by other means. Now, let us come back to this question of competitive tendering. For those people, why should not management say we want to competitive tender? Because I say to you, if I were management, those people go by other services than ambulance. Quite often they do go by services that have been tendered out. So why shouldn't they do it in the case of the ambulance service?
Well, the management would say that, or Mr. Clark would say that, wouldn't he? But our view about competitive tendering is not that it's got anything to do with efficiency. What it has got to do with is driving down wages and trying to get the job done as cheaply as you can possibly do it. And that's not necessarily efficient. What we want to see is a discussion with the government about this dispute. The problem with this dispute now is that the government is actually refusing to meet us to discuss these matters, and that's what they ought to do.
Right. Now, you said there it's not necessarily efficient. That would be a matter of dispute between you and management. Management might say, not only would it be efficient, but it would save money which we could then spend on your higher skilled workers. But a viewer might be saying, well, if he's accepted that it could be potentially efficient, and if there is this room for dispute, if he just holds the line and says, we're not prepared to change, then behind that very congenial front is a man fighting the old trade union battle. I'm defending my jobs, whatever the case. Perfectly proper thing for a union leader to do, maybe, but not necessarily will they go on, therefore, to equate your case with the interests of the health service.
Yes, but you see, the problem with this dispute is that we are 1,000 light years ahead of the government in terms of wanting an efficient use of resources in the ambulance service and an efficient ambulance service. You see, Mr. Clark has tried to muddy the waters throughout this dispute. He first of all brought in the whole question of paramedic training in the middle of the dispute. Now, it has to be said that paramedic training has not been led by this government. It's been led by the trade unions. Indeed, for years, this government, and Mr. Clark, when he was the health minister in the early 80s, actually refused to introduce paramedic training. We had to drag them, screaming and kicking, into paramedic training in 1986. And now, ever since 1986, they haven't provided the funds for that training, and so consequently our members are queuing up for it and can't go for it because the funds aren't there. When they are trained, the government doesn't provide the equipment for it. Our members actually have to go out to buy the defibrillators themselves. So we are a long way ahead of the government in terms of wanting an efficient use of resources. But privatization per se is not an efficient use of resources.
Now, let us say that they grant you that they haven't had a coherent training in paramedical training, and that needs to be done. And they say, we will do that. Let us say, for the purposes of argument, that we will do that. But we are still driving on efficiency in order to finance that. And they say to you, one further way we can get efficiency in this service, and if you really have the interest of the service at heart, you'll come along with us, is as follows. We want to link pay to productivity. Are you prepared to link, in future, pay to productivity?
No. And I'll tell you why. In 1986, the employers and ourselves spent 2 years getting rid of bonus schemes and productivity payments in the ambulance service because they were terribly inefficient. See, the ambulance service isn't a service where productivity bargaining can in fact give you a good deal, either for the patient or for ambulance crews themselves.
There is no scope for productivity bargaining in the ambulance service? There's productivity measures to be taken?
There's no scope for productivity bargaining. There is always scope for efficiency measures, but not linked to productivity bargaining. And there's a difference there. You see, what we want is an efficient service with well-paid staff. What the government appear to be suggesting is that we should return to the bad old days of the 1970s and the early 1980s, where ambulance staff had to get reasonable rates of pay by entering into productivity schemes, bonus schemes, which did nothing for the efficiency of the service, but purely brought in a system whereby the staff and the employers had to put forward all sorts of fancy, as Mr. Clark would call them, Spanish practices in order to get a reasonable rate of pay for the staff. Now, that's not the way forward.
Now,
efficiency is,
yes,
but not linked with productivity payments.
There are other forms of productivity bargaining which don't involve bonus schemes, as you know. Now, some viewers may be saying, well, he's not really prepared to talk turkey on the key things. We know in our industries and in our work we have to do productivity deals. That's the way of the world, and the ambulance service should not be any different. For instance, if management said, we want you to perhaps consider in some areas reorganizing shift working. We want to perhaps reorganize the 999 service, and that will require productivity deals. Now, some viewers might say, we know why he doesn't like productivity deals, because even though some of his members may get more money out of it, there may be fewer jobs there. And so he's being an old-fashioned trade union member saying, not one job goes.
No, you see, because all of the things you've just mentioned, rechanging shifts, all of those issues, we've done. In 1986, we introduced a new salary structure for ambulance staff. And all of those productivity improvements were made in 1986, and that was when we achieved parity for the qualified ambulance man or woman with the fifth-year firefighter.
And
it's been the loss of that parity over the last 3 years that has caused this dispute.
And no amalgamation, for instance, of 999 services if they wanted it? That is not a productivity measure that might work somewhere? You don't talk about that in return for pay?
You see, I don't know what you mean by the amalgamation of 999 services. In respect, I don't think Mr. Clark knows what he means either. The problem with this dispute is that the government don't have a strategy for the ambulance service. They don't have a well-thought-out, intellectually based strategy for the ambulance service. We do. And that's the problem. The government is having to respond to a trade union view which has been thought through, which has been thought out, which takes into account efficiency, but also takes into account the need to pay staff reasonably if we're going to expect them to do the sort of jobs they're doing.
Okay. Now, you have always said, we will go into talks at any time with no preconditions.
Right.
Mr. Clark says he wants to go into talks if you will discuss things like productivity deals, if you will discuss things like we just talked about before, what you call privatization, what they call competitive tendering. You say you won't discuss those,
no.
So
we have never said that. No, we have never said that.
You will discuss those things.
No, we have never said that. We have said we will discuss anything.
And you will discuss those things which you say you'll discuss those things, but there's no way in which you're going to do any deal on them.
Well, what we have said is that we will discuss anything that the government wants to discuss with us. The people who have stopped the discussion has been Mr. Clark. He has said that he will not come into the negotiating room around a negotiating table to discuss the issues that we want to discuss as well. So we're saying a meeting with no preconditions, and he keeps putting conditions on the meeting, and that also is the problem with this dispute, is that the government are refusing to allow their negotiators to negotiate with us. The moment they do that, I believe we can resolve this dispute, but it has to be resolved on the basis of the government meeting some of our demands and us responding and meeting perhaps some of their demands as well.
Can I put it to you that you are now in something of a corner? You have adopted all the measures in this dispute which you think it is proper to adopt. So far the government has stood firm. You now rely on the loss of political will in the Department of Health. No sign that that is happening. If you don't get that loss of political will, you're going to lose.
No, you see, we can't lose the dispute because the government can't afford us to lose the dispute. Let us just take the hypothetical position whereby the government forced Britain's ambulance crews back at 6.5% this year. The amount of anger in the service would be such that we would not have a good ambulance service in the future. Now, the government can't afford to do that. What is needed is a negotiation. We need to negotiate on the basis of issues like our pay formula. We need to negotiate a decent increase for this year, and we need to look at some of the issues that the government has raised as well to deal with training, efficiency, and the future of the ambulance service. And if we do that, two sides coming together, trying to put together a decent deal for the ambulance service for the future, this dispute could be resolved to the satisfaction of the government and the trade unions. But it needs a leap of imagination on the part of the Health Secretary to bring that about.
And you're prepared to say to your members, if the Health Secretary doesn't make what you call a leap of imagination, or what I've described as losing his political will, you're saying to your members, stick it out for month after month after month.
No, our members are saying to us that they will not return to work unless they get a reasonable settlement of this dispute. It's our members who are making that decision.
Roger Poole, thank you very much.
Thank you.